Hello, welcome to the third episode of our Doctor Who retrospective, and this episode, of course, is the Unquiet Dead. So do you want to start, Aaron, by just giving your overview take?
Yes, I'm Aaron and he's Rob, by the way. Yeah, we've got getting a bit lazy with the intro.
By the time we get to Chibnall, it'll just be... Yeah, alright. That's
the end of the episode. I sort of look forward to becoming less and less professional as time goes on. Anyway, so my general impression in sort of bullet points is another step down. Episode 2 is a step down from episode 1, episode 3 is a step down from that, but still good. But I think we're veering towards mediocrity at this point. That would be my overall impression.
See, that's interesting. I think this is better than episode 2, and I actually quite like this episode. I think when it started, I was kind of expecting not to like it very much. I was kind of expecting it to be kind of a bit of a boring, and it's certainly by all accounts a pretty standard episode. There's nothing. It certainly doesn't sort of stand out as an incredible episode. What I did like about it was as a historical episode, with a historical character. Obviously it has Charles Dickens in. It has that quality that I think is sometimes missed in Doctor Who historical episodes, in that the historical character that happens to be in the episode, it makes sense that it's that character versus a different character, because it's a ghost story and it's very much in the sort of Dickens kind of style. It has a lot of that kind of aesthetic to it. It's like, oh, I understand why Charles Dickens is here, versus just, I don't feel like you could just put the same story with a different historical character in a different period of history and it work as well as a story.
I think quite a lot of the Doctor Who historicals have that quality, though. Like you've got you've got Witches with Shakespeare.
Yes,
of course. You got, what's the historical season 2? It's actually
Queen Victoria.
Yeah, I may be about to eat those words, because Queen Victoria and a werewolf. Yeah.
Does she need to?
Agatha Christie
is like, it's a sort of murder mystery, but certainly the actual alien of the thing is not really that Agatha Christie.
Not much to do with it. Okay, yeah, I take your point.
I think thematically, yeah. I don't think those other historicals are necessarily bad, but I think there's a strong thematic, like it feels very tightly kind of connected plot and theme, and Dickens being there.
See, I agree, but for me that's little more than it's almost like an aesthetic thing of, you've got Charles Dickens and you've got ghosts. Like, that's not a really substantial story.
Well, I think it goes a bit further than that, in that you do have some kind of maybe certainly maybe they could have looked at this in a bit more depth, but Dickens obviously has this kind of change of this development of going from being very skeptical and being like, well, I like writing ghost stories and I like illusions and things, and also, just as an aside, I love the way, I can't remember what the actor's name who plays Dickens is, but I love the way he says illusion. He kind of goes from being very skeptical to obviously being convinced of the reality of these alien ghost things. And there is some mention of his kind of social commentary, which is what Dickens was big on. And that kind of thing, sort of, again, it feels a bit more than just literally being like window dressing character. There's not a huge amount of it, but I think it is there.
I do agree that the episode does a good job of making Dickens a character with an arc, but it's a very simple arc, and that's kind of I sort of feel like an arc that's simple should be attached to a much more complex story, but the story is also very simple. Like, this is one of those episodes where I kind of feel like everything is running at like a 6.5 out of 10 level, and nothing is really excelling. Like, the atmosphere is good. It's not amazing, but it's good. The characters are good, and it's all good. But whereas with The End of the World, we had a few things that were like, oh, this is really good, I really like this bit, and oh, not so sure about this. This feels much more standard.
Well, it's maybe slightly less interesting as a thing to critique. It's arguably less interesting because it hasn't got that, oh, this was really working or this wasn't. It sort of throughout is pretty solid, but it's not sort of incredible. But I think for me that's where I would actually place it above End of the World, in that I kind of thought, as much as that had bits that I liked, overall I didn't like it as much, whereas this, it's maybe not got those really standout bits, but overall I feel like it's a lot more cohesive as an episode. And I mean I like Dickens' kind of Victorian aesthetic. I mean, certainly that appeals to me. Granted, I take your point that that's not arguably more than sort of an aesthetic thing. Doesn't necessarily, but I think it interplays with the plot well.
I do think it looks very nice as an episode. I think, like, the sort of vibe with the I think a dog is trying. This is your daily scheduled dog enters the room interlude. It happens at roughly the same time every episode as well. Oh yes, Penny's come to offer her opinion.
Now just standing there.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
The dog has sat down. God, this is thrilling. I'm on the edge of my seat. Anyway, where was I? So I think the episode looks very authentically Victorian and very authentically historical. And I did also think, because obviously, like, period dramas and historical television, they have a certain look to them, don't they? This captures that look really well, which I think on a sort of meta level helps separate it from something like The End of the World, and even Rose, to a degree. So I really like it. I really like that element of it, and special effects wise as well, because it's mostly practical sets, and the only CG is the Gelth, who obviously is so abstract that it's so I think it looks very good as a whole. It's very there were no moments of that's really bad CGI or something like that.
I think in terms of also what I did like about the episode, I like that there was a sort of well, actually, in the first instance, I like that the Doctor was not familiar with the Gelth. I always like it when the Doctor doesn't show up and it's just like, it's this and that and this and that, and this is what they're after, and this is, there is a sort of some, again, relatively basic. It's not a really like you say, it's not a complicated plot by any means. It's not a complicated thing that he has to work out, but there is that element of working stuff out, and I like that there is a bit of deduction in going, they go into the gas, they're sort of gaseous, and some nod to, when human bodies break down they release gas, and so that's why they go. Obviously that's very soft sci-fi, but I do enjoy that there is a bit of a sort of internal logic to it, of a bit of a justification of how they manage to do this control, and that there is a sort of working things out. I also like that the Doctor kind of falters a bit in his judgment because of the relation of the Gelth to the Time War.
Yes, but again, that's another thing for me. It's not done as well as it could have been, because you have that whole element, but the Doctor's sort of feeling guilty over the Time War, that's little more than like a small look that he gives, and then he's like kind of, we absolutely need to help them. But then when he's wrong, it doesn't really delve into the consequences of that. Yeah, just like, oh, I was wrong about that. It's like, I feel like Rose could be angrier with him or something like that, because I really like the argument they have when they're talking about the ethics of the whole thing. And I suppose in a sense the episode, I think, is making itself less interesting by just being, oh no, they were actually evil the whole time. But then it has the opportunity to do something interesting by criticising the Doctor, but then it just doesn't do it. Which, again, it's not bad, but it's just nothing is pushing the boundaries in any way.
On that point, that kind of does tie into what I would kind of make as, I think, my only major or my only notable criticism of the episode, which is that I didn't like the choice to have the Gelth, when they're revealed to be evil, to suddenly go red and like snarly, and I thought, because I thought actually it'd be much more interesting to just leave them looking how they are, and not sort of just play into this like, you can just tell because when they're evil they look evil. It's just sort of, and it's unnecessary. I mean, it didn't make them less.
See, stuff like that I normally don't have an issue with, because I try to keep in mind that Doctor Who is a family show. There's children watching, and that doesn't bother me at all. I like it when it tries to be that. But I feel like this episode, it's not actiony enough. Like, I mean, I don't know about you, I don't remember being a fan of the Gelth when I was a child in particular. So I feel like it's the Gelth aren't really gonna, making them red is a very simple colour coding trick to sort of, I don't know, it makes it easier for children to understand.
It certainly telegraphs that these are now actually, they're bad. And I did think that when I was watching it. I saw that scene, and in my head I was like, I'm not a huge fan of the fact that they suddenly turn red because they're evil now, and sort of, snarl and there's fire. But I did then go, well, it does make it very clear that, because I feel like actually in the dialogue, partly because the Gelth are sometimes a little bit difficult to hear.
God, I was going to mention that. I couldn't understand what they were saying quite a bit of the time.
That you almost did kind of need that just to really telegraph they're evil. But I think there would have been another way of doing that would have been maybe a bit less.
Just make them easier to understand, for one thing. Like that's the obvious thing for me. And the thing I was saying about like kids watching is like the red helps telegraph that to the children, but I feel like a kid isn't going to be all that engaged in the Gelth to begin with. I don't think they're going to really care, so you might as well just stick with a slightly more complex angle of just keeping the colour the same adds a bit more depth to the whole.
It does, and I kind of think I also like, I mean, like I say, I think that's sort of my main criticism of the episode. In terms of other things I liked about the episode, I thought it was a nice, relatively complex bit of character interaction where you had the Doctor obviously being like, is she called Gwen?
Gwyneth.
Oh, Gwyneth, yeah.
Because they're doing the thing of my ancestor looked exactly like me and was my name plus or minus a few letters.
And I was like, they had that. I was like, I feel like I know it was Gwen, but like it can't have been Matt because that's just two on the nose. Anyway, where the Doctor's like, Gwyneth has to open the rift and all the rest of it, and Rose is obviously trying to advocate for Gwyneth, and but then ultimately there is also the thing of, well, ultimately it's Gwyneth's decision as to whether she was. I thought that was a nice scene because there was no sort of obvious, this character is clearly right, just unquestionably correct, and this one's wrong, and that adds an element of interest to the scene of, you can see where Rose is coming from, you can see where the Doctor's coming from, but you can also see how Rose, in trying to advocate on Gwyneth's behalf, kind of forgets that she's a person.
Well, it's an interesting representation of both their characters, because obviously the whole point of their dynamic is that Rose is the human, she offers the human perspective, and the Doctor has the alien knowledge. So the Doctor is coming at it from a purely objective, cosmic standpoint of, this equals more life, therefore good. And he's not like wrong to think that, but Rose is thinking about Gwyneth as a person, The Doctor's weakness is that he's not thinking about, well, what would that mean for Gwen?
Yeah.
Whereas Rose is only thinking about that and
Yeah.
isn't thinking about the girl. So that's an interesting demonstration of their two characters. And I think as a general strength of the episode, the character work continues to be solid and consistent. I mentioned to you while we were watching it that when Rose talks to Gwen, it's exactly the same kind of scene she had with the worker on platform.
She feels
1.
uncomfortable talking down to a sort of working class person, and is sort of very taken aback by the pay and the way she's treated and all the rest of it.
So like that's just strong characterization. Although I did feel moments like that impressed me a lot more in the first 2 episodes. They're not so much now, and I think it's because the curse of lowered expectations from coming straight from watching Chibnall episodes going right back to the beginning. I think that's waning, and I'm now sort of being like, well, yeah, the characters are consistent episode to episode. That's not that. That's not such a big deal. It's still good
it's
work.
Nice. It's nicely done, but
it's not impressing me as much anymore.
Yeah, I think in that same scene, another thing I liked was the kind of setting up of both that Rose's dad is dead, and also though because Gwyneth goes,
you've been thinking about it a lot more now.
You've been thinking about it a lot more now.
That's so good.
And it's a very subtle thing, because obviously the reason is that she's now with somebody with a time machine, and that becomes the plot of Father's Day, that, well, I've got a time machine, I can go back and save my father. And it's not like you could... There's sort of 2 ways you could go with that, where like you just don't have that dialogue in the first instance, which would be sort of fine, like it's not sort of essential dialogue. Or you could go the other way and make it a really ham-fisted kind of like, you're thinking about time, and like you could really labour the point, and I think it's done really well in that. Again, Davies... Well, actually, sorry, this isn't Davis, this is a Gatiss episode.
But Davies edits all of the scripts as showrunner. I would suspect he added that to give it a little bit of continuity.
Actually, this was something I was going to mention. This is the first non-Davies episode of the first series, and I think interestingly, it doesn't feel... I mean, again, this is what should happen, but it doesn't feel like tonally different from the prior two. It feels very consistent, and I think that's a credit to both Gatiss and the later on the other writers involved, but also Davies as a showrunner, keeping a consistent feel, and I think that is something he was very good at keeping kind of a consistent world and feel through
it wasn't jarring, but I could feel the difference, primarily in just the overall structure of the story. One of the things that Davies is very good at is like the pacing and keeping things moving, whereas I noticed with this story you have a lot of stuff happening at the beginning, and then you're just in one location for the whole rest of the story. Now that worked, but part of the reason why I noticed it is because a lot of Mark Gatiss scripts, spoiler alert, I'm not going to have very nice things to say about Gatiss scripts going forward. I think he's almost universally a really bad Doctor Who writer, but this one was actually pretty good. But I think he's also, as a general issue he doesn't do a very good job with the pacing, I don't think. Again, in this case it worked, but I just noticed it was the same kind of thing of, well, we're in one location and we're just here having scenes in this one place for the whole story.
There was that kind of also does remind me of something which I thought was maybe a little weaker. Again, I don't think it was really... Overall, I liked the episode, and I don't think this was really a major problem. But... there were quite a few scenes that were sort of standing in a room talking, doing a bit of sort of exposition. I don't think it was the end of the world, and I think certainly people sometimes can get a bit sort of dogmatic about you must never have your characters have a conversation, which is sort of a bit like, well, they're going to have a conversation at some point, and I think within the context of this story broadly, it didn't get to the point where I was like, yeah, okay, can something happen now, please?
So I think it worked for this one because this had a sort of spooky, subdued vibe. But the only reason I even mention it is because I've seen Gatiss write actually scripts, and he writes them in exactly the same way. Like Empress of Mars, which is essentially like a fight the whole way through, is still just characters standing in rooms and talking and staying in one place. And so... Yeah, so it's less. It fits
better with the tone.
Yes, with that knowledge, it feels like this is less of a deliberate decision and more this is all he can do. But he's picked a story that works for that style of writing,
fitting better to his strengths, arguably, or just the way he writes. And I do think, to be fair, the overall tone was solid in terms of feeling like a Dickensian ghost story. I think it did have sort of Christmas Carol vibes, as it were. And there were a few nice little references. Like I liked when they're in the cellar and Dickens runs out of the cellar and out of the front door, they have the Gelf kind of come out of the doorknob, which is a nice little Christmas Carol reference.
But they didn't overdo it, because when I saw that, I was like, oh god, is it going to form a face around the doorknob? But it doesn't. It's like the whole body comes through it, and that was and
there's a sort of bit of distortion on the door, but it's not like, hey, it's the Christmas Carol, it's a nice... And I think that is what I like about it, is it's not constant kind of quips. I mean, one of the things, to compare it to the Shakespeare episode with Martha, that there are points in that episode where it's a bit quippy. It's a bit like, hey, you remember we're with Shakespeare? Whereas this, I felt like it was like, they kind of had that a little bit in, just got it out of the way in the carriage where the Doctor gets in and sort of fanboys over Dickens. But beyond that point, they just interact very sort of as people, and there's not a lot of kind of, hey, remember this line from Dickens or whatever.
One thing I will say as a general point, I have always loved when the Doctor is really excited about fairly mundane things or mundane people, because you might think that someone who has seen all the time in space would be just, he's a writer, but he appreciates like so many different things on so many different levels. So I've always liked that the Doctor does react extremely enthusiastically about famous figures from Earth. I think some people might view it as a bit like, why would he care about Charles Dickens? He's an alien, he's a time war soldier, yada yada yada. But I think it fits in with his character.
I think it definitely fits in with his character as kind of this. Fundamentally, the Doctor travels around. His stated thing a lot of the time is, he's just trying to travel around. The fact that he ends up getting embroiled in all these sort of events is not really what he's after necessarily. He clearly enjoys it. He clearly enjoys it. But, he goes around because he's interested in events and things and people. And it's sort of... I know I do like that character. I do like it when the Doctor is excited to meet people and crucially kind of appreciates them for what they were doing, not merely just as like, hey, I get to kind of check off Charles Dickens as somebody I've met. It's like, oh no, like I do actually like the writing, and he is a fan of Dickens for what Dickens was doing. It's a little thing, but it's nice. Trying to think if I've got much more to say on the episode.
I think I had something which has now... just a very broad point, just a thing I want to sort of discuss is obviously the whole thing with Charles Dickens is he's learning to broaden his mind, which I think is a very good sort of lesson. I think it's a great little character arc and an important message. There's more to the universe. I am unsure, and I'm literally formulating this opinion on the spot, how I feel that the method through which they do that is talking about ghosts. Because on the one hand, it makes sense within the show that like these the ghost. It's a very Doctor Who trope. The ghosts are actually aliens. Here's the science, quote unquote, behind it, and yada yada yada. So in that sense, it makes sense. But on a very personal level, I really, really hate people who look at obviously pseudoscientific bullshit and just go, "Well, we've got to keep an open mind." You know. And again, it's difficult because in this instance, it's not. In this instance, in this world,
it makes perfect sense.
It is a real thing. But it is directly referencing real life things that are not that are just rubbish. That's just complete nonsense. And I don't know. I feel like someone could sort of look at this and come away with the impression of like, it is important to keep an open mind to
just conceivably believe anything.
Yes,
I think I actually did have a moment in the episode of kind of having a similar sort of thing, in that there's a line where Dickens goes, "It's all true," and I'm like, well, it's not all
all of it.
Specifically, this thing is true, and yes, you should, when presented with new information. And I think really that is sufficiently clear broadly in the episode, that it's like, when you get new information, you should, because there is this bit where Dickens is like, "Oh, is my entire outlook on the world wrong?" And the Doctor's like, "No, there's just a bit more to it." But I didn't love him being like, "It's all true."
And also the bit where Dickens is checking for like wires and stuff, which is an entirely sensible skeptical approach, and the Doctor's being a bit eye-rolly. As like, again, it makes sense in character because the Doctor knows this is true, so he just wants to get on with it. But in real life, you absolutely should be skeptical of these things.
And it does seem a bit strange there are points where the Doctor is just kind of like, well, just accept it, just accept it, which I think even in universe is a bit like, well, people can still trick you. I mean, obviously, in fact, interestingly, it's a bit of a contrast from in Rose, where the Doctor's impressed by Rose's deduction of like, well, the Autons must be students, is that he's like, I respect that you're wrong, you're completely wrong, he knows they're aliens, but he respects that with the information that Rose has available to her, it's a reasonable deduction. And in a similar way, it's like with the information Dickens has available to him, it's not unreasonable for him to be quite skeptical about like what possibly, especially given at that time, in that period of history, there was a huge amount of people putting on shows and seances and and they were charlatans. And
in the next episode, even the Doctor has that whole conversation about the space pig, and he compares it to P.T. Barnum and the mermaid and stuff like that. I think that is possibly just a product of this is written by Gatiss, and the other episodes are by Davies, because Davies is an absolute skeptic. He has very little like patience for made up nonsense and trickery, and to an extent faith even.
And but broadly, I mean, all that said, I do really like it when Doctor Who does incorporates kind of fantasy or spiritual stuff into a sci-fi framing.
I absolutely do too. It is just the way Dickens interacts with it, and the way the Doctor reacts to him, and stuff like that.
I mean, obviously, and I'm sure this will be a point of discussion we're coming to, with like the Satan pit. That I love that as a there is a creature that is in some sense the devil, but that the stories kind of stem from that and go in different places. But I think the way the Doctor does interact with Dickens in this episode, there are points where I'm a bit like, you're kind of being a bit unreasonable. Equally, he wants to get on and sort out the issue, and the Doctor is sometimes quite brusque with people when he is trying to just sort it out. One other thing that just came to mind is I did quite like right at the start. In fact, the pre-title sequence. I thought it was a nice setup to have the obvious, the dead are coming to life, and then the Undertaker comes in and is sort of just like, oh no, and another one. I think that's a fun kind of.
I thought that was good. Yes.
And I do like it when you get this. I would argue quite realistic thing of strange things are happening, unusual things are happening, but ultimately people are still trying to just get on with their life, and he's sort of like, well, we just got to go and find the corpse and bring it back. And
I do have to say, I think possibly the only thing in the episode that to me was like, that's an actual standout, I'm going to remember that, was the shot of the corpse in the audience. Particularly before they draw attention to it, and all the subsequent shots where she's just there, and if you weren't noticing you wouldn't see. I thought it was really creepy and very eerie, and genuinely quite scary actually. So I thought but that's honestly this sort of praise has turned into a criticism. That's kind of my issue with the episode. That is the only thing that stands out in my mind, and it's like the rest wasn't even like bad, so even that doesn't stand out in my mind. And I don't know, I can't call it mediocre. It is good, but it's just not like with Russell T Davies episodes, he will sacrifice, as we discussed last time, he will sacrifice the overall structure and internal logic to get to the big moments that he clearly has planned from the beginning. This is much more consistent and cohesive, but because of that, it's clearly not aiming for any big moments. It's kind of holding itself back so that it doesn't break itself in any way or strain at all. And you could argue that that's like quote unquote objectively better, but for me it's just much less interesting.
I think it's definitely, I think it's certainly less interesting, and I think that's sort of, certainly from like an analysing the episode perspective, it's less interesting. I think that's sort of apparent from, at least myself, I'm kind of struggling to think of a lot to say about the episode, whereas the last one, there was stuff to say even in where there was a variance of quality. I think for me, just thinking about it though as an episode to watch and as part of a series, I would say it's a good episode. It's nothing absolutely outstanding, but I think it's a pretty solid, good episode. And I enjoy the setting. The one other thing I would critique, there was one shot in it that I thought looked like a classic Who shot. And that was literally just, and this is a nitpick, but when you first see Dickens and he's sitting in his room, there's this, I think it's like a pull focus shot. And the way it's framed, something about the way it's framed, and I think also the lighting, just made me think of classic Who, because it was slightly awkwardly framed. It felt like there hadn't been a lot of thought. It was like, well, we need Dickens in the shot and we'll pull focus on him, and that's sort of it. The composition was a bit strange. I warned you this was a nitpick. Yes. What it actually reminded me of a little bit, and I don't know whether this is just because the periods are similar, reminded me a little bit of Talons of Weng Chiang, the Fourth Doctor, a serial where
they're not at all problematic.
Yes, the very sensitive and but you know, there are those shots in classic Who where you sort of look at it and you think, well, you clearly just sort of went, well, we need this in frame, put the camera here, okay, go. But like I say, that's literally one shot.
I have to say, I didn't notice anything particularly bad about that. I want to ask you, did the episode feel short to you?
Maybe a touch. I think there was a brief moment when it sort of finished where I sort of thought, oh, that's it. Have we actually sat here for 45 minutes?
Yeah. See, to me, it felt like half an hour, which sounds like a really big compliment, and it should be. But I don't. It felt like half an hour because not a lot was happening. Exactly. Rather than what was happening flew by at a brisk pace. It just sort of felt, I just couldn't, because like we were in the house and I was just sort of expecting as an audience member, okay, we're going to move from this house to somewhere else. And like when they're talking about the Gelth and stuff, I'm like, okay, there's going to be a bit of a second act, and then because I remember the finale under the arch, I was like, then we'll get to the finale there. But we just we go almost pretty much straight from, we're like, oh, we'll talk about the Gelth, straight to the seance, straight to the arch, and it always immediately goes wrong. I don't know. Again, I think that's part of the. It's not sinking its teeth into any particular ideas. Yeah. It's just sort of having. Decently well written things happen.
I think that is a fair critique. I think, like I said, I think it's a good episode, but I think it is a fair critique to say there are a lot of unexplored ideas in it. I think there are a lot of things where you go, if you just push that a bit further, you could have had actually a really interesting explanation of even any one of them. Like, I think there are a few. I mean, the main one I think is this sort of, the Doctor kind of making arguably a poor judgment because of the personal thing of the Time War and the Time War still being very well. I do wonder whether there's an aspect of them feeling like they couldn't explore that because Dalek is the episode where that's explored, and we can't sort of preempt that and undercut it. And so we can at the most sort of reference it, but we can't have this scene where Rose is going, well, look, you're only doing this because you're worried, or however you do it about, which, I don't think is necessarily a defense of the episode in and of itself, because you can go, well, maybe then you shouldn't have written the episode around that.
And you could write it that it's like Rose could attack him for being arrogant, because he is being very arrogant. You don't have to get into the Time War stuff right now.
Because she doesn't have the understanding of that to be able to sort of get into it.
Interestingly, my memory is that in Bad Wolf and Party of the Ways, where you obviously have the Doctor comes back to the future and he sees that he left things in a worse state than when he originally arrived. Do you remember what I mean? Like when he shuts down Satellite 5, he's like, everything was grand.
Right,
oh no, I actually screwed everything up. That story also, to my memory, doesn't really deal with the consequences of that. I don't know if that's... See, in that story it makes sense because it's got a lot of other stuff on its plate. So I don't know if that's, like... It just so happens that the two stories that mentioned those things wanted to do other stuff, or if there was, like, some sort of... The writers weren't comfortable criticising the Doctor as a character because they wanted him to be the hero. Like, I'm not sure what the reasoning is.
Yeah, I mean, but just as a viewer, it's hard to get into the you that's all behind the scenes stuff that you don't necessarily able to tease out from just viewing the final.
The dog is on the move.
And just sort of vaguely looking. So
I hope the listeners like the dog interludes.
I really hope because they're not stopping.
They are not stopping. Absolutely not.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's always a chat. Well, the thing with criticising the Doctor is, I think it's always great when the show does it. If they commit to actually criticising the Doctor.
Yes.
It's when it's kind of like, oh, let's have a bit of a sort of nudge at, well, maybe the Doctor's a bit more of a grey character than we perhaps like to think, but don't go the whole way with it. That is a bit weak. And there is maybe an aspect of that, because I think, yes, like you say, there are ways that you could do it in this episode that don't undercut the need for the Time War to remain a bit obscure at this point in the series. Have you got any?
I think so. Looking at the episode on its own merits, I think I've said basically everything I need to say. Just because obviously we've talked about how we're watching these episodes from quite a few different angles. From the angle of just watching it as part of the series, I think the only thing to add is that I think it does a good job of continuing threads, like we already mentioned. It continues the characters well, but it also adds a little bit more to the Time War, and a bit more to sort of Rose experiencing new cultures and stuff like that. So I think that's strong. But I think also in a strange way, because this isn't like last episode was a direct continuation. This is very much a monster of the week thing.
Yes.
So I think in that sense it does a good job of introducing what will actually be the format of the show going forward. So I think that's all good. But then obviously the episode in itself, as we've said, not a whole lot to write home about. But looking at it, there's one point I want to mention in terms of knowing what's to come and looking at it from a broader context, and that's Gwyneth's sacrifice at the end. Because I don't think we've done any Chibnall bashing this episode.
And we need to get in our quota of Chibnall bashing.
Precisely, because I thought about it when it happened, because one of my biggest issues with the Jodie Whittaker Doctor is her complete willingness to let other people die for her. Like, she doesn't even really try to stop them sacrificing themselves for her. And then when Gwyneth was going to be doing this, I was like, oh, hang on, has this always been a thing? But then I thought about it, I was like, well, no, because Gwen has to be there to hold the Gelth back. So it does not make any sense for the Doctor to light the match when she could just do both things. And then also they go the extra step and say she was literally already dead. And that just occurred to me, like, the amount of effort they put into that to make sure the Doctor would have given his life were it possible. Whereas in the Chibnall era, Jodie will straight up, like, do you remember Legend of the Sea Devils, where the guy was like, I'll do it, and she's like, you can't, I want to, and she's like, oh, you're really brave, mate, well done, and then she just leaves it. It's like, the Doctor would never do that.
I think actually,
the Doctor would fight tooth and nail to be the one to die there.
And I think actually that's I think that's an interesting point as well, in terms of dialogue, or in fact actually lack of dialogue, again to indulge in a touch more Chibnall bashing. The Doctor in this episode puts his hand on Gwyneth's neck, which is how he knows she's already dead, because there's no pulse. But he doesn't put his hand on the neck and then go, you've got no pulse, you're already dead. Like, it trusts the audience to be attentive enough to, and like, obviously when he comes up he explains it, but he has to justify it to Rose, like, because Rose looks at him like, what the hell have you done? And he has to justify to her, like, she's already, it doesn't just let the Doctor off the hook of being like, whatever. Rose expects an explanation of why it was justified for him to leave. And he is very much like, I had a similar sort of thing because I'd forgotten the specifics of how it happened, where he tells Rose, "Oh, go! I won't leave until she's out of danger or whatever." And the way I was expecting the scene to go, because obviously, I knew that Gwyneth was going to die because I've seen the episode before. What I was expecting to happen was a similar sort of thing, like in the Parting the Ways, where he kind of lies to Rose of being like, oh, I need you to go and do something in the TARDIS, and then sends the TARDIS home, which obviously works fine in that episode. But I was kind of expecting it to be that kind of thing, to be like, well, I need Rose out of here, so I'll lie to her to make sure she gets out, and then I can have the frank conversation of like, look, you're gonna, and that's actually not how it plays out. He actually is being truthful that he is going to try to save Gwyneth, but in fact it is not possible to do so.
It's just, and it just stuck out to me because it's just a couple of lines of dialogue. It's really not hard. And it's not like it happened once in the Chibnall era. It's a consistent pattern of behaviour. It's just.
Well, we'll run out of critiques to make by the time we get to.
Oh no, we will not. No, we will not.
Maybe I'll just, for the sake of some entertainment, try and defend.
Shall we bring on someone who likes Chris Chibnall episodes when we get to series 11? And
do we know anyone who likes
I don't.
That might be interesting. We'll see. But on this episode, I don't think I've got anything to say.
I'm out. I think fine, decent, but nothing special. Still good, though.
I think it seems to me like I liked it a bit more than you did, but certainly, it's not like a standout episode that I would be like, you really, really got to see the Unquiet Dead. So that's this episode. Next episode is
Aliens of London.
Oh yeah. Okay.
That's the first two-parter.
The first two-parter. Yeah. So see you then. Ta-ta.